Thank you so much for waking up early and coming to our first blockchain breakfast. How many people are in the blockchain business already, or how many people have some cryptocurrencies or tokens? Whoa! Wow! I never see that. Wow. Oh. Well, then this could be an unconference and everybody else can talk. So today we're going to have the incomparable Edan Yago, who is CEO of FF8 at the moment. He'll be talking about consensus algorithms and the state of the art in blockchain today. I promised that if we have more than 25 people show up by 7:30, then I will eat a tea bag. And we have 22, I think, without pillaristas, but the pillaristas woke up and got here, so I'll be doing that show at the end of the session. Welcome to Edan Yago.
So I was telling you about The Dark Knight Rises, now with much more of a vague voice. In that film, there's the scene where he's standing telling the people of Gotham that they can take back their freedom. And behind him there are these giant grey columns, and he's standing on the steps of what in the film is the courthouse. You guys remember that scene? So that building is where they filmed it, the location, is a gorgeous building, an ancient building. In American terms, it's actually like 150 years old. But it's this old Gothic building with massive columns made out of giant pieces of granite. In the very heartland of what used to be the industrial steel capital of the world, Pittsburgh. And what that building is the biology department of Carnegie Mellon University. And it was built with the money of the Carnegies. And the whole thing is built as this Gothic song to art and to science and to what Carnegie wanted to be the marriage of those two. But because it's in Pittsburgh, a city which didn't see sunlight because of all of the steel factories for 100 years, that's the way it feels. It's grimy, it's gritty, it's Gotham. And when you enter that building, the whole thing is a maze. Most of the building is underground. So the building itself is 3 stories above ground and 4 stories underground in this labyrinthine maze of laboratories. And there are giant vats with pigs floating in them, in places where they're growing E. coli bacteria, and all kinds of weird experiments are being done. It is the most Frankenstein place you could possibly imagine. And 7 years ago, I was in the very bowels of that building. And I was running a biotech startup that I had started while I was at Carnegie Mellon. And we were working on diagnostic tools for bowel diseases. So we were sitting in the bowels of this old, decrepit place, working on other bowels. And early in the morning, like now, I arrived there one day through a foot of snow. And I used to wear this long coat and these very, very high boots. And I had, I think the building inspired me to a Gothic style myself. And I came in and I wound my way down to the bowels of this thing, and I was sitting at my laptop and I opened up my morning reading and I was going through my articles, and then I saw this article which made my heart stop, and my hand began to shake and I spilled my coffee all over the laptop, ruining it, frying it. And what I read, this was 7 years ago, was the first time I'd ever read an article about Bitcoin, and it struck me like a thunderbolt. And I spent the rest of the next weeks just reading. I read the Stitch white paper, got into the forums, bought my first Bitcoin, and got into the thing like a demon, possessed. And months later, I left that company and I went to California to start a Bitcoin company, which eventually became Epic. And this, I think, is a very different story from what most people tell when they tell about the first time they encountered Bitcoin or the first time they encountered cryptocurrencies or blockchain. Most people that I've spoken to in the years since tell me that they dismissed it at first. They didn't see why it would be valuable. And I think the reason my experience is different is because of what had happened 20 years before I read that article. So when I was 9 years old, I was sleeping at my grandparents' house on a sleepover one night. And in the middle of the night, there was a huge amount of commotion. I was woken up by the commotion, even though they had attempted to make sure that I wouldn't be woken up. And I snuck out of the room to find out what was going on, and peering out of the side of the wall, I saw that there was a lot of excitement happening with my uncle and his wife. And I didn't understand until much later what had happened, but what had happened was that my uncle and his wife had made their way to my grandfather's house. My grandfather had given them his car so that they wouldn't be driving in a car with a license plate associated with them. And they drove through the night, that night, to Botswana, crossed the South African border into Botswana, and never came back to South Africa because the apartheid government had declared them enemies of the state. And this happened to several members of my family again after that. And the reason was that my family was fighting against apartheid. And the implication to me as a 9-year-old who didn't really understand any of this was that a few months later, my mother gave me my winter jacket. And it was very, very heavy. And the reason it was very, very heavy was because she had sewn gold coins into the lining of the jacket. And my job was to fly alone from Jan Smuts Airport to Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv, where I would be picked up by my family, and I basically became a gold mule, or, you know, I like to say smuggler. And for the next 2 years, I was smuggling Kruger rounds out of South Africa because at Jan Smuts Airport at the time, children didn't have to go through the metal detector. And so I think it was with that background that I read about Bitcoin, and I was like, wow. 9-year-olds won't have to smuggle jewels anymore. So for me, what Bitcoin and blockchain is, it's a story about freedom. It's a story about us being able to take sovereignty and control over the primary and most important aspects of our lives. And for a long time, I thought that that was going to be limited only to money. Because what Bitcoin was this idea of a digital commodity, right? This digital value that you can share and store and that people can control in the same way that they control the thoughts in their mind. It becomes truly theirs, truly transportable and truly something for the digital age. And over the last few years, what has happened is that what I thought was going to be an amazing revolution in money has become a much, much broader revolution in the way that we coordinate ourselves as a species. And the fact that an idea which was to me so powerful that I destroyed a laptop over it 7 years ago has become even bigger is probably the most astounding experience I've ever seen in my life. So I find blockchain exceedingly complicated and confusing. I thought I knew what it was, and over time it's evolved to just become a more complicated, more interesting story. And when I say that, you know, when I talk about how it's become a mechanism for coordination, so what I mean is I think it goes back again to my story in South Africa. So we as a species have basically only had two real methods of scaling and coordinating ourselves. In other words, we start out as individuals, right? But as individuals, we're pretty pathetic. You know? Human beings alone generally don't do very well. But human beings are not ever supposed to be alone. Human beings are a social organism. And even before we were humans, we were living in small bands. And the way that we coordinate ourselves in those small bands is through, maybe once it was more through, you know, grooming and fighting and tickling, And now a lot of it has to do with gossip, right? What we know about each other, our ability to remember different people, their faces, our understanding of how different people recognize each other. And even there's a big leap, right? So other primates live in groups of 5, 10, if they're more advanced, so maybe they're chimpanzees, they can live in groups of 30, 50, but after that it starts to break down. And the reason some people think that we developed languages so that we could scale those groups to perhaps as much as 100, 150. And then something happened, right? We invented this ability of growing plants ourselves. We developed agriculture, we started herding, we started to build larger communities, we started to build settlements and cities. And the coordination method had to change because there's no way through gossip and familiarity that you can coordinate in groups of thousands. And so we developed this thing called authority and hierarchy. And that has been the only method we've had of scaling societies larger than small groups of people for all of human experience, for all of human civilization. Until now. Now we have a method. With Bitcoin, for example, we are coordinating people across the entire globe for a monetary system. With Ethereum, we're coordinating people for even more sophisticated tools across the entire world in a way which doesn't require authority. And the story of South Africa is a story of authority going wrong. So the fact that we now have a new method is very, very exciting. One of the things that's interesting to me about Pillar is that Pillar are seeking to do the reverse of what human experience has been. Human experience has been that in smaller groups we didn't have a lot of authority, and groups got larger, authority grew. But then we sort of copied what we were doing in larger groups into smaller groups, and even smaller groups like companies started to have clear hierarchy and authority. And in Pillar they're looking to do away with that. And so I think that's very much in the spirit of what blockchain is about. And I think blockchain is fundamentally about rethinking how we as a species can organize ourselves, perhaps less on the basis of violence and authority. And to me, that is maybe the most exciting journey or thing I could be involved in the world. So thank you very much. I don't know if we have time for questions, but that's kind of my view on where blockchain is. That's all.
A bit of an overview of consensus algorithms, consensus methods.
So I think I may have misjudged the time. I'm happy to provide.
No, we have time.
We have time.
So we have, but also not only where we are, but where you think things are going. In consensus, I think a lot of people here are Bitcoin owners, cryptocurrency owners. If you want to know.
So I think there are two primary questions which are very unclear today in the blockchain space. The first is, are we going to see one primary blockchain which acts as the primary coordinating method across most of our different activities? And that used to be, I think, what most people thought would be the outcome. The reason is, if you think about coordination, right? Coordination is providing people with what's known as a Schelling point, a place for them to come together to coordinate, to agree. That's why when you think about governments, you think about having one head and a hierarchy, and that's why when you want to meet someone at a train station, you want one meeting point instead of two, because if there are two meeting points, now you're losing that coordination. So coordination obviously brings you to try and coordinate around one point rather than two, or three, or more. And so for a long time, everyone thought that Bitcoin was going to be the coordination point. And now some people think that maybe Ethereum is going to be the coordination point. But both of them have substantial scaling issues, and they are also designed to provide specific features but not other features. So now we've started to see this proliferation of thousands of different protocols. And it's a real question as to whether or not these will wither and die and we'll end up with one, which makes a lot of sense. I mean, if you think about what is most similar to blockchain, it might be the internet itself, right? So we had many, many intranets, we had all kinds of companies trying to build their own. Microsoft were building the information superhighway, and it's all coalesced into one system which is interoperable. Okay? But actually, if you peel back the covers and look at the internet, you've got UDP, and you've got TCP/IP, and you've got SMTP, and all kinds of different protocols that become a stack and that work together in what we call the internet. And I didn't even mention the World Wide Web, right? What we call the internet. And so, what does that look like? And a lot of trying to peer past the veil of the future and figure out what that looks like is one really interesting question. The second really interesting question, which is related to this one, is what does the coordination system actually look like? So today, the most popular coordination system is what we, when we say coordination system, what today we call a consensus mechanism, right? How do you reach consensus among the group? The most popular one is proof of work. So I'll give a quick overview of proof of work and how it works. Because I think that helps. Some of you maybe will know this, but the thing about proof of work, right? A lot of people describe it as kind of solving mathematical problems, but that's actually not the interesting part of proof of work. The interesting part of proof of work is this: I need to figure out a way to reward people for validating transactions, and I need to figure out every single time who, for example, in this room, if we had to choose every single time who gets to be the boss of this particular round of validation, we want to do it in such a way that even the person themselves can't abuse that position. And the way that you create that situation is by creating a situation where that person doesn't know in advance that they're going to be the boss, so they can't collude with anyone. And they are the boss only for a short space in time, a short moment in time, and they therefore can't take advantage of it going forward. So we're validating transactions, and we want to have a situation where each time a different person randomly is going to be picked to be the validator. And we want you to participate in this, so we'll reward you for doing this. So what we have is a lottery system. Each of you gets a ticket. This ticket is the work that you've done. You buy the ticket by doing proof of work. If you have the winning ticket, which is the winning hash, you get to sign the block. You get to choose which transactions go into the block and which transactions don't go into the block. And you get rewarded for this work by being able to issue to yourself new Bitcoins. That's basically the proof of work consensus mechanism. The problem is that it's unlimited. You can buy as many lottery tickets as you want. And so the Chinese are buying lots of lottery tickets, right? So they've got entire hydro plants with huge amounts of electricity, and next to them they have massive warehouses full of machines just doing hashes, just generating these lottery tickets. And you have a similar situation in many, many other places in the world. It's very, very expensive. And that's part of the issue of it's part of what makes Bitcoin difficult to scale. Now, right now, all of the major systems work in proof of work. So,
and right now, how many per second on Bitcoin?
How many transactions per second? So, Bitcoin may, depending on how you calculate it, you're probably looking today around a maximum of 14 transactions per second in Bitcoin, which is nothing. Rob is saying 3. Again, it depends how you calculate it. So today we've got SegWit in, and there's more transaction aggregation happening, and there's SegWit with Beach 32 and transaction, blah 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 blah. Anyway, we don't know. What's happening in practice is that we're getting less than 6 or 7 transactions per second today through the system, right? Now, the weird thing is that if we were to double the capacity of the machines mining Bitcoin, what would happen to the transactions per second?
Not much.
Nothing. Nothing. Because the lottery game has nothing to do with the amount of transactions we can do. Right? It's just a way of... So the fact that you're buying more lottery tickets doesn't change the fact that at any given time only one of you can be the winner, only one of you can validate, and that one of you and some of the bandwidth issues around that is the bottleneck. So people have been saying, all right, well let's see if we can come up with other methods. Right now, out there in the wild, there are a few blockchains that are using a method called DPoS. And what that does...
It's proof of?
It's distributed proof of stake. And really, most of the distributed proof of stake systems are using a really old method of coordination, which is basically based on voting. And because of some of the inherent problems of maintaining a decentralized system over a network and being able to do so with the voters, they're actually even more limited in some ways. So the good thing about proof of work is that anyone, anywhere in the world with a computer, in theory, can spin up their computer and start creating these lottery tickets and participate. Maybe only in a very small way, but they can get in the same way that you're buying one lottery ticket and someone else is buying 10,000, you still have some chance of winning, some chance of being the validator. In these DPoS mechanisms that we have today, which are used by systems like BitShares or EOS, there's a very, very small number of people who can actually vote and keep the system lively and keep the system moving. How small is this number? Well, in EOS, right now they're limited to 25. Not 2,500, 25. They're going to raise it. They have ambitious plans. And within 2 years, it will rise to 49. In a different system called Tendermint, you can do up to maybe 1,000, but you start to lose liveliness. Sorry, you start to lose liveliness quickly, and so in practice, pretty much limited to 100. So, for example, there's a system trying to provide interoperability between blockchains called Cosmos, and they're going to have 100 validators, and their vision is that those 100 validators will over the next 5 years grow to 300, and those people will validate all of the transactions for interoperability across all of the blockchains in the world. That's like 300 people who are going to be the masters of the universe, right? Enough people that we could put into a room even this size. So there are other efforts now to build more robust systems which can scale better.
We're thinking about proof of stake. So what's the throughput on something like some proof of stake systems right now?
So EOS are claiming they can do 1 million transactions per second. Now they only have a testnet up, so we don't really know. But they're claiming to do 1 million transactions per second. So the trade-off there is if you have fewer people coordinating, it's easier to coordinate them, and therefore they can have higher throughput. Now, taken to its logical conclusion, you could imagine a system which could do essentially unlimited throughput, right? But it would have to be completely centralized. There would be only one validator. And in fact, we have a system like that. It's called PayPal, right? PayPal don't have any real issues ramping up their transaction throughput on Christmas or whatever, but you're completely at the mercy of PayPal under those circumstances. So right now there's this really big trade-off around how decentralized you can be versus how much you can scale. And so there's one of the interesting things that is going to be happening, I think, over the next few years are the efforts looking to solve that. And in fact, I'm in the process of almost at the end of the process of having Amplify be acquired, and I'm moving to work in partnership with the Pillar guys, and we're working on a potential solution to this problem. And there are others who are working on this as well. So Ethereum are actually one of the teams who are trying to make a very big effort in this space. They are planning on a huge bet, a bet that they said that they would make from day one, but a huge bet. They're going to move their entire system off of proof of work and onto an entirely new and untested proof of stake system, which they call Casper. And their proof of stake system maybe has an entirely new and, not entirely new, but for blockchain, an entirely new and different trade-off. So what they're looking to do is they're looking to create a situation where people can stake their coins in a proof-of-stake mechanism, and then basically, instead of burning electricity, you're burning your ability to use the coins for a given period of time, and in this way, you are you get your lottery tickets, and you're hoping to generate randomness in the system in this way. Now, there are all kinds of attacks that are unique to that proposition, which are very, very technical. But there's one particular attack which is very interesting in the context of proof of stake, right? Which is that because people are using stake, the more money they put down, the more votes they get. Now, we have all had the privilege of growing up, or living now, in a democracy, right? And we've seen that sometimes democracies don't always make the best decisions, right? And we also, I think, are aware of the fact that the moneyed classes, right, the wealthiest people in our society, sometimes have undue influence in a system where it's one man, one vote. Ethereum are looking to move to a system where it's $1, one vote. So under those circumstances, one could imagine that there's no such thing as undue influence of money. All of the influence of money is due, right? And so what Ethereum have claimed is that the money that you're putting down is ETH. The people who are putting the money down want the Ethereum system to succeed so that the value of their Ethereum goes up, and therefore their incentives are perfectly aligned with the incentives of the users of Ethereum, because everyone is trying to do the best for the system together. Now, this may be, but I think, looking at some of your faces, some of you think that this may be a somewhat dubious claim, and so there's a potential to go down a path which maybe leads us to a new and particularly muscular form of plutocracy with that type of proof-of-stake system. So this is a real big problem, and it's a really interesting one, because if we get this right, and if we can solve both the social engineering problems and the technical engineering problems that come with creating a truly scalable but very, very difficult to corrupt coordination problem, we'll really have provided ourselves with, as a species, with a new way of coordinating ourselves, which doesn't rely on the implicit threat of violence or authority or money that governments and the wealthy have always provided. But if we don't, we could empower the very, very narrow classes in our society in a way which is even more fundamental than we've ever had before, maybe since feudalism, right? So in feudalism, we all lived on the land, and all of the land was owned by a very, very small group of people. Now we all live in the digital realm, and if that digital realm were governed by a blockchain, which was governed by a plutocracy, it would look like basically Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, and Sergey Brin getting into a room and deciding what you're going to have for breakfast.
Let me come up and ask a few questions. So proof of stake. How many people are familiar with proof of stake? Pretty much. Good. So what do you think will happen with Ethereum and switching to proof of stake? It's supposed to be this year, right?
Right. I don't know. One thing that I have realized is I have absolutely no idea what's going to happen ever. But what I think is likely, some of the things that I think are likely, is that right now there's an entire class of miners. The miners in Ethereum make more money than the miners in Bitcoin, in aggregate, by a factor of roughly 2. So they're making on the order of $5 to $6 million a day mining Ethereum, in aggregate. Right? This is a particularly golden goose, right? That's just billions of dollars up for grabs. And Vitalik is coming to them and saying, listen, thank you, but you're excused. right? And I don't know that they're going to necessarily want to be excused. Now they have had much longer. The original idea was that Ethereum was going to go through this thing called the Ice Age, which was going to freeze out the miners, and this was supposed to happen almost 2 years ago. And it's been pushed off and pushed off and pushed off, which means that the miners have had much, much longer time to embed themselves in the situation, coordinate themselves to become more wealthy. So I think that we may see a very, very substantial fork in Ethereum.
Oh.
With miners going one way and Vitalik going another way. We may also see that threat of that to cause some kind of compromise. And even after that happens, I think that's when the fun begins. So I think proof of stake is going to look like it works great until it doesn't. And that's what I think my biggest fear with proof of stake is that it will work really, really well. In the same way that dictators work really, really well at the beginning, and then you kind of pay for it in installments on the tail end. That's my biggest fear with proof
What
of stake.
about Bitcoin? Is Bitcoin going to have to change from proof of work to something?
So
otherwise, we're going to use up all the energy in the United States pretty soon.
yeah, so
And it's the same number of transactions per second.
yeah, so Bitcoin's in this Red Queen race, right? So I don't know if you guys are familiar with this idea of the Red Queen, but through the looking glass, Alice meets the Red Queen, and she's running as fast as she can. But the faster she runs, the faster the ground beneath her moves, and so she's running as fast as she can, and always faster, just to stay in the same place. And that's how Bitcoin miners feel, right? So that's how we got to a point where we now maybe are consuming as much electricity to power Bitcoin on a per daily basis as we are to power Denmark.
Right. About, right?
Yeah. We don't know. I mean, it's very hard to estimate. But on the upper bound, that's where we are.
Yes. Yes. Quick question.
What do you think about things like Woodstock? Lightning Network.
Right. So Woodstock and Lightning Network help scale the system and help scale the transaction throughput, and they definitely will do that, but within certain limitations. The problem is, it doesn't matter how much you scale the throughput of the system, it doesn't change the incentives for the miners, and so mining as this lottery system actually has nothing to do with throughput. So what may happen, what a lot of people think is going to happen is one of the reasons that mining and hash power and the electricity consumption has been growing so quickly is because the price of Bitcoin has been growing so quickly on the one hand, and at the same time, the ASIC technology, the chips, the specially fabricated chips that are being used to mine Bitcoin have been getting better and better and better and better. And they've been going down from 28 nanometers to 16 nanometers, and now they're going to 7 nanometers. At some point that stops. Moore's law, catches up with them, and they can't advance faster than Moore's law. At which point, the difference between a chip made today and a chip made in 2 years is only maybe 2x or 1.5x instead of 10x as it is today. So then you get into a situation where potentially people start sitting at home and heating their apartment, and at the same time, instead of generating the heat through just burning electricity, they generate the heat through doing hashes, and then maybe they're paying or subsidizing their heat. And so then potentially...
Lots of people are doing that.
Sure, but for Bitcoin itself, I mean, in 5 years, is it still proof of work?
Almost certainly.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. Then it's probably going to go to zero, right? Because other things will just eclipse it.
Well,
no?
Well, the thing is, right, if people are heating their apartments with it,
then
at some point, and the price stops going up forever, like at some point it's sort of stabilized, and at some point you reach an equilibrium level. And the equilibrium level is maybe not as bad for the environment as even as it is today, because a lot of it is uses that would have been happening anyway. And the approach that...
But the Chinese are not heating their apartments. They got massive.
Right. But in part that's because of the way the economics are currently structured.
Because of the 10x.
Right. So if you're a miner, so now today no one can heat it because only specialized miners who are able to change their equipment every 2 years can really keep up in the race. So if you're a Chinese miner, you can have these massive warehouses, but massive warehouses become far less economically interesting if they're competing with all of Northern Europe that is heating its homes.
Yeah. Okay, now let's go to a lightning round of 1 minute per each one. Proof of something else.
Right.
'Cause there's about 1,000, and I keep hearing, you know, proof of bunny rabbits reproducing, and proof of noses growing, and whatever else. So let's pick one. What about the radix one? What's that called? Proof of time?
Yeah, so proof of time elapsed.
Okay, you got 1 minute.
So proof of time elapsed is a method for generating randomness that was developed in the 70s, which Intel have developed one system that uses it, and another group based here in London, Radix, use it. It's very interesting, but potentially extremely vulnerable to attack, because you're generating randomness in the system, and there are behaviors. You can pretend to be a good citizen, and you're generating these random numbers, and you're trying to show that a certain amount of time has elapsed by generating these random numbers, but you could potentially fool the system in various ways, and so right now nobody's actually building, I don't think, anything in production on that, maybe until we solve those problems.
Okay, next one.
Yeah.
Next one would be proof of.
So there are actually not that many, to be honest. I mean, so there's a group called Block Collider, and Block Collider are trying to generate randomness by taking advantage of randomness that is generated in other blockchains, and then everyone goes and collects the randomness that is in other blockchains and comes and shows it, and then because people are supposed to be able to show the same randomness, basically this is just so you know certain numbers get generated and you grab it. We don't know yet. It's not live, but it's a very interesting concept. Block Collider are using this for a very, very specific use case. They are using it to build a interoperability system through blockchains, because it doesn't work without other blockchains doing their own. So it's a sort of like second layer consensus mechanism. Yeah?
Yeah, there's a strong theory that quantum computing is just around the corner, developed by companies like IBM and Google. That potentially speeds up the hashing rate of SHA-254. So where's the vulnerabilities in blockchain
quantum
consensus?
Right.
So around the corner is quantum computing, which is potentially a risk for any system based in generating lots of amounts of random numbers. Bitcoin and most of the other well-designed systems are actually less vulnerable than they appear on the face of it to this. SHA-256 maybe is vulnerable to quantum, but with Bitcoin, before you display, so like your Bitcoin address, for example, is not a SHA-256 hash, because it's gone through several one-way hashing algorithms, and those one-way hashing algorithms are actually considered quantum hard. So Bitcoin is probably, on a first order at least, resistant and because Bitcoin, as most of the other systems are as well, resistant to quantum, but at some future point we may need to make a shift. Yeah.
I'm going to say that not in the next 10 years, and if quantum computing is practically able to crack today's blockchain technology in the next 10 years, I will eat 2 tea bags.
Oh, come on.
3 tea bags. See in 10 years. Is there another stake? Is there another proof mechanism? There's one you're working on?
Well, yeah, so we're working on a system called bounded proof of work. So this is taking advantage of something that really only happened over the last 2 years. Over the last 2 years, pretty much every single piece of consumer hardware, so your phones, your laptops, have started coming out with TPM chips. They're embedded. These are separate environments, physically separated environments connected to the motherboard that are called trusted computer environments. And they are, you can't see what's happening in them. So they have their own, they generate their own randomness, they can do their own signing, they can do some simple computation. And if you try and look at what's happening inside of them, you destroy them. So they're called trusted computing modules. And one way in which some of you may have already used this is if you have an iPhone and you've stored your fingerprint is actually not stored in the phone, it's stored in the TPM, so it's not accessible in any way to any human. Now, We are working on a system which uses the randomness generated in these chips to essentially do the mining. In other words, you get your lottery tickets only from these chips, and you have to demonstrate that your lottery ticket came out from one of these chips. And our goal in doing this is to take us back to sort of where we were years and years ago, where people could mine in their dorm room or even maybe mine on their phone. Because we are using proof of work, which is very well validated, but the ecological impact would be minimal because it's a very, very low power unit which exists on your phones, and it would allow people to become validators or miners themselves again. So we envision a world of tens of thousands of validators, maybe hundreds of thousands of validators. And there's also a way that we can use these chips to share secrets between each other, which no human ever gets to see. And so that we can use this method to create interoperability between blockchains as well. So it's potentially a very, very interesting avenue of research. And we actually think we'll have something up and running live that people will be able to start playing with in a few months. There's someone else who's working on doing something similar, but maybe even more radical. There's a group that is being advised by Moxie. Moxie is the guy who developed the cryptography behind Signal. I don't know if you guys know, or WhatsApp. You guys use WhatsApp? Mm-hmm. So he's advising a group out of San Francisco, and what they're trying to do is trying to build a blockchain which exists in its entirety. So not just the consensus algorithm, but the whole thing, all of the database and everything would be placed into these TPM chips. And so it would be a and so it would be a blockchain that no human being ever gets to see. And we just have to trust what our phone is telling us. Wow. So maybe at that point the consensus algorithm goes from human beings using a blockchain to develop consensus between themselves to, all right, we just trust the computers. Whatever they're telling us, that's what we do. So that's
all right. Okay. Thank you to Edan Yago.